Good morning and welcome to another edition of United Way for Southeastern Michigan's What's the Word Wednesday. My name is Audrey Walker, and today we're talking about voting rights and what you should know before you cast your ballot in the upcoming local elections. The last 10 minutes of today's town hall are reserved for questions, so please leave your questions in the Q&A box. If you're watching on Zoom, in the comment box on Facebook. Now I'd like to give a warm welcome to Kyle Dubuck, United Way's Executive Director of Advocacy, Communications, and Marketing.
Thank you, Audrey. Good morning, everybody. So, advocating for voter rights and equitable access to the ballot is an important and long-standing part of our work at United Way. Ensuring that the voice of our community is heard loud and clear by local leaders and policymakers is essential to the advancement of our mission. And this year, with 39 bills currently under consideration in the state legislature, which if passed would ultimately serve to suppress the vote, it's more important than ever that voters know their rights and feel confident in their knowledge and ability to cast a ballot in every election. So before we get started, I want to ask everyone, please consider joining our advocacy efforts on this issue by visiting unitedwaysem.org/protect-our-vote and just take a moment to send a message to encourage your legislators to oppose these bills. And we'll share the link here in the Zoom chat and in the comments on Facebook as well. So today we are excited to welcome Merissa Kovach, policy analyst for the ACLU of Michigan, another organization working to defeat these bills and preserve the right to vote in our state. Merissa has been with the ACLU since 2008, first as an intern and then as a legislative assistant, field organizer, and currently policy strategist. As a policy strategist, she works to build local activist bases of ACLU members and assist with campaigns on issues like the organization's current efforts to prevent voter suppression or any barriers to the ballot. She graduated from Michigan State University's James Madison College, Go Green, with a BA in political theory and constitutional democracy. And she has previously worked in the Michigan legislature, as well as a government affairs consulting firm in Lansing. So today, Merissa is going to share some information on voter rights, including some detail on the recent proposed legislative changes. And we'll go from there, and we'll have some time for questions. Merissa, thank you for joining us to talk about this critical issue as we approach the August 3rd election.
Great. Thank you so much, Kyle. I'm happy to be here. Thank you, everyone, for joining this morning. So I'm going to share my screen. And for those of you who are visual learners like myself, you'll have some things to follow along with. Let's see. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about what is happening in the Michigan legislature and what's happening in Michigan as far as voting rights goes, but especially voter suppression as well. As that was mentioned, a 39-bill voter suppression package was introduced a few months ago this spring in the Michigan Senate by the Michigan GOP. And this is a package that's essentially chock full of bills that intend to make it harder to vote, make it more costly and burdensome for our election officials to hold elections. And this is really coming off of the tail end and following a national movement to suppress the vote across the country. We've seen states this year in rapid order introduce similar pieces of legislation and pass bills that make it harder for all of us to vote and have our voices heard and make it more costly and burdensome to administer elections. And we're seeing that happening in Michigan. We've seen that happen over the course of this past spring. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've seen in those bills and what those restrictions really look like. And these are restrictions that really take us backwards too, from the progress that was made in 2018 when voters overwhelmingly voted to amend the Michigan Constitution to expand access to voting rights. So this is not what Michigan voters expressed that they wanted. And this is really a backlash to the incredible increase in turnout in election activity and voters coming and making their voices heard in what was like an unprecedented, like successful, secure, and accessible election in 2020. So before I dive into what's in these bills, what's also important to know is that the real intention and end goal of this effort is to potentially put a ballot initiative in front of the legislature, that anti-voter legislators will work with their supporters to collect enough signatures in order to qualify an initiative before the legislature, and have the legislature pass that so that it is not veto proof. So that's really what the concern is that we're looking at. And we know that this legislation, Governor Whitmer has signaled that she will veto anything that makes it harder to vote, makes it more costly to vote, with no clear benefit to our election administration. But what's important about these bills still is that they're moving, and it signals what legislators in the Michigan legislature in Lansing are willing to do to roll back voting rights. And it hints at what we might see if they try to take initiative to pass this through the ballot. So that's why we've been focusing so much on what these bills are. So I'm going to dive into what rises to the top as some of the biggest themes and concerns that we're seeing in this package of bills that's been moving through the legislature and having hearings over the last few months. One of the biggest threats, which you've maybe seen in the news for the past couple of weeks as well, is because it's gotten some movement, is a strict voter ID bill. Now, Michigan already has a voter ID law. It is a law that has worked for us for over a decade because it balances security as well as accessibility. It ensures that if you don't have a photo ID on election day when you walk into the polls, or you forget it, that you can still vote, that you're not going to be disenfranchised because you can prove who you are by signing an affidavit under penalty of perjury. This is a process that has worked, like I said, for over a decade, and really balances that need for security in our elections while ensuring that voters aren't going to be disenfranchised as well. So, but what these bills will do will eliminate that ability for you to sign that affidavit and prove who you are by signing that affidavit. So that means if you lose your ID before election day, if you're not someone who's able to obtain an ID, if you can't get a replacement ID before election day, you won't be able to vote if you go into the polls. And this is going to disenfranchise over tens of thousands of voters in Michigan, as well as discourage voters who have trouble obtaining ID or may have to jump through some extra hoops ahead of election day to obtain it. It'll discourage them from participating in our elections. So these bills in particular seem to be what's being prioritized in the Michigan legislature. So far, the Senate has passed it. The House, about 3 weeks ago, made some amendments to it and passed it as well. They made some amendments that actually made it the most extreme, even more extreme. This already stands to be, as it's written, the most extreme voter ID law in the country, but they pushed it even further so that it would rise past other states that also have this extreme law and disenfranchise possibly even more voters. The House sent that bill back to the Senate, and the Senate is now working on it, possibly making some changes. So it's been ping-ponging around, but ultimately what we know is that the Michigan legislature is poised to pass this bill. There's going to be a few more votes, and then there's an intention to send it to the governor, who will surely veto it. But what's important to know is that this is going to disenfranchise over tens of thousands of voters and does nothing to improve the security of our elections at that. And what we know too is it's going to have a disparate impact on Black and Brown and lower income voters as well. So in the face of just knowing that it's not even going to improve our elections, which alone should be a reason to veto it, that the fact that it is going to have that discriminatory effect too, it is even more cause to reject this legislation. But there's also some other bills in this package too that carry some themes that really will make it more burdensome for voters. So there are restrictions on absentee voting, bills that would prohibit your clerks or the Secretary of State from offering prepaid postage on absentee ballot applications or your absentee ballots, just creating that unnecessary extra hurdle for a voter who has to now track down postage or track down a stamp, and for no clear reason. Very much a a solution chasing after a problem here. There's also legislation that would prohibit the Secretary of State from proactively sending out absentee voter applications, which are not ballots. It's just the very first step that anyone would have to, a blank form that anyone would have to fill out, who is a registered qualified voter, in order to obtain your absentee ballot. There are ballot box restrictions, again, very much a lot of solutions chasing after problems, requiring ballot boxes have to be closed at 5 p.m. on election day, which is going to confuse voters because the polls are open until 8. And it's going to, for no good reason, eliminate a point of access for voters and create a lot of confusion. There's very expensive restrictions on ballot boxes, requirements for high levels of security and video surveillance that could be cost prohibitive if we're not fully funding our elections, and force the hands of clerks who want to make ballot boxes accessible to their voters, but simply can't afford to do so. And then we're also seeing some bills that politicize the role of challengers and the county boards of canvassers and precinct challengers who can carry an important role in providing some oversight on election day and ensuring that processes are running smoothly, that voters are having their rights respected, that election officials are following protocols. This would tilt the scales very much in favor of the parties and eliminate the rights of nonpartisan challengers to participate in elections, giving the role strictly to the dominant political parties, and carving out places where it'll be political parties rather than the people really having a hand in influencing the day-to-day operations of election day and absentee voter counting boards. And then finally, after election day, the process of canvassing and really counting and going back and checking on the votes and making sure they were counted properly, making sure all absentee ballots were counted, the canvassing process. Again, injecting a lot of partisanship into that process to make it more vulnerable so that political parties will have more influence over not just election day, but also how our elections are certified. So a lot of very concerning things to keep an eye on. I will say all of these bills that fall under these categories have yet to be voted out of the Michigan Senate Elections Committee, but we're watching them. They look, at the moment, they're making some changes. A lot of these bills were written in a vacuum without a lot of stakeholder input. So over the last few months, they've been receiving stakeholder input, and we're hopeful that some of these can be corrected, that a lot of these won't move forward as is, but it's something to watch to see what over the course of this summer the Senate decides to move forward and send over to the House, and what might be rising to the top on their priority list for a potential ballot initiative. And then with that, I have to share what it is that you can do yourself to help here, and I'm happy to share my slides so that everyone can have these links. But reach out to your Michigan State Senator and State Representative. Let them know that voting is important to you, that we have a system right now that works, that if there truly are places of improvement, but that any sort of improvement, it should have bipartisan support. It should have the support of the voters and election officials as well. And then share what's happening with your friends and family. Create that echo chamber. Lansing can very much be a bubble, and a lot of the goings on of what happens there doesn't reach the general public, and this is important. And we know that this is important to Michigan voters because they turned out in record numbers in 2018. So create that echo chamber and share what's happening with your friends and family. And then finally, to wrap it up, what's also important is we have some elections coming up in next month, and some of you may have some local elections taking place that you'll want to participate in. So what I want to share is what's absolutely important to know is none of these restrictions that are moving through the legislature right now have taken effect. So you still have the right to vote and not be disenfranchised if you don't have photo ID, or if you show up to your polling place on election day without ID. You still have the right to prove who you are by signing that affidavit, which is just a simple form to fill out. So on election day, or getting ready for election day, which is going to be, there's going to be some primaries on August 3rd. We recommend check your voter registration, make yourself a voting plan, check your voter registration, confirm if you're registered. You can go to www.mi.gov/vote. Find your polling location. You can view your sample ballot. You can see what locations and phone numbers and hours your city and township clerks are open. If you'd like to vote absentee, go pick up your ballot early, fill it out on your own time at your clerk. And then finally, here's what you need to know if you are going to vote in person, though, on election day. Elections are August 3rd. Polls are open from 7 to 8. They're probably, fortunately, you probably won't face a lot of lines for this particular election, but you have the right to vote if you show up to the polls by 8 o'clock, even if you're waiting in line. And if you're not yet registered, you can register at your clerk's office up to and on election day. And do bring your ID if you have one. But if you don't, again, that's okay, because these strict laws haven't passed yet, and you'll still be able to vote on election day. And with that, I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Merissa. Yeah, we do have some questions here. And also, if you would like to ask a question, please again, leave your questions in the Q&A box on Zoom or the comment box on Facebook. So one of the questions that I had, especially since you mentioned the upcoming primary election on August 3rd, is that if the voter suppression package were to pass and become implemented, would that affect the election on August 3rd or in future elections? How immediately would something like that go into effect?
That's a really good question. The upcoming election will not be affected in any way. And we know too that, fortunately, we have a governor who is pro-voter, who's pro-voting rights, and she will veto this bill if it does get in front of her in this round. She'll have the ability to do that. So we're not in danger through this particular legislation of losing voting rights. The real danger is going to be if they move forward with a ballot initiative strategy.
Mm-hmm.
But no, your rights for this coming election will be preserved. Absolutely.
And then once, like, if she does have that veto, is there a ballot measure once that, like, what does the timeline on that look like?
That's a good question. So Michigan has an obscure law and an obscure process for if citizens wish to bring an initiative to the ballot and to amend Michigan law as a statute, they can collect a requisite number of signatures. And if they collect enough signatures, they can qualify their initiative for the ballot. But before it goes to the ballot, it makes a pit stop at the legislature. And the legislature has an option to vote for it, vote against it, do nothing. If they vote against it or do nothing within 40 days, that initiative, that law will go on the ballot for voters to decide. But if they opt to vote for it within 40 days, it automatically becomes law and it bypasses the governor's veto. It's veto proof. So it's really this loophole for anti-voter legislators to get past our pro-voter governor and be able to sidestep it that way by collecting, a small percentage of signatures from the electorate. So a timeline we're looking at, they haven't yet launched that. We don't know exactly what it'll look like, but we've been told it will include strict voter ID, which is why it's so important to share what's happening now with your friends and family and spread the word, and that it'll likely include at least a half dozen other voter suppression policies as well. Likely some of those things that I mentioned that are from the 39 bill package, making it harder for you to vote absentee, making it harder to access ballot drop boxes, making it harder for our election officials to do some extra outreach and provide some extra help to voters by eliminating some hurdles as well.
So what are my basic rights as a voter?
Well, as a voter in Michigan, thankfully to Proposal 3, you have more rights than ever. So I would say what's important to know going into election day is that you have the right to vote in a number of different ways. If you want to vote absentee, every single voter has the right to request an absentee ballot, and that allows you to vote on your own time at home. You could also go to your clerk's office to request an absentee ballot as well, fill it out on the spot and turn it in and vote early. Or you can vote, if you prefer, to put that ballot into the tabulator yourself on election day. You can go into and vote on election day. And then I would say also, if you don't have ID to vote, you can, it's very important to know you can still vote. You don't lose your right to vote if you just don't have simple photo ID. You can sign an affidavit, and you can do that if you're voting absentee or if you're showing up to the polls on election day. And then finally, what's also important to know is if you're not registered, there's no deadline to register in Michigan. We used to have a 30-day deadline ahead of an election to register, but now you can register to vote. Right now, you have about a week where you can register. If you have a Michigan driver's license or ID, you can register to vote online for another week. And then 2 weeks ahead of the election, you can go into your clerk's office in person and show proof of residency and register to vote there. And you can do that all the way up to election day, and on election day up until 8 p.m.
And so if I'm going online to register, where am I going to?
You're going to go to the Michigan Secretary of State's office. And I am happy to, if we can drop a link in there, but I think it's the Michigan Secretary of State's office. There's a voting center where you can find out where your polling place is, your clerk's hours. If you'd like to go pick up a ballot for yourself, you can look at your sample ballot so you can make a plan to vote and do your own research and everything that you need to know. You can find out also your registration status. If you find out that you're not registered at your current address, you can go update the registration either online or at your clerk's office, and just really use that to carve out what your voting day plan is.
And we have a couple questions here regarding polling locations. So one of the questions is, what if I show up at the wrong polling location in my city? Can I vote there?
You cannot vote at a polling location where you're not registered. The poll workers will direct you and can help you figure out where your proper polling place is.
Okay, and then do you have information on if I need a ride to my polling location, or what other options there are to call and get a ride?
That is a great question. I personally don't have that information, but there are often volunteers, and depending on where you live in Michigan, there are lots of volunteer services, and I'm sure we can find that information for you if you need a ride in your community to get to the polls.
Okay, great. And can you explain why it's important for us to vote in primary elections?
It's important because you're deciding who's ultimately going to be on the ballot, what candidates you're ultimately going to have to choose from in your final election. So I would say primaries are just as important as the final general elections as well. It determines what pool of candidates are going to rise to the top, and what your selection is going to be. And if there's a candidate or a cause that you feel strongly about, that primary is the first opportunity you have to make your voice heard.
Okay. And how would I support suspicious behavior at my polling location?
Poll workers there are poll workers in your polling location who are there to help. If you have some concerns about something happening that's improper, let a poll worker know. They're really the front lines here, and they're there to help and make sure our elections are running smoothly. So let the poll workers know.
Okay. And we've got another question here. If there is a ballot measure to suppress the vote, will there be a counter ballot measure?
That's always something that's on the table. Our hope is that a suppressive voter initiative won't even pass those first couple of hurdles, that they won't be able to collect enough signatures, that it won't be popular enough for them to collect enough signatures to even qualify. So that's really where I hope our focus can be, and that's why spreading the word about this is so important, to create an air of toxicity around this idea that we would be possibly passing something, collecting signatures to suppress the vote. But certainly every option is on the table for, how to combat this.
And do you expect any of the other bills to move to later this year?
I do think some will. I know some will. It's yet to be seen which ones will rise to the top. I will say over the past couple of months, there was a very strong united coalition of voters and election workers and advocates, community members, grassroots organizations who came out united against a lot of these suppressive efforts. So I think their voices were heard to some extent, and that's fortunately, hopefully going to mean a lot of these don't pass, but we do know that there will be some that make it through probably at the end of summer going into the fall.
Mm-hmm. And what are different ways that people can get involved with the ACLU to fight these bills?
Well, you can go to our website, which I can put into the chat. It's www.aclumich.org. And you can sign up to volunteer there. We're working on recruiting volunteers to help with these efforts moving forward. We communicate regularly on what's happening each week in the legislature too, so you can take action and take the most relevant action based on what the legislature is doing on any given week. And we'd love to have your support there.
Mm-hmm. And what types of, can you expand further on what types of volunteer opportunities there might be? What would that look like?
Sure. We can help meet with you so that you can be prepared to meet one-on-one with your legislator, that you could host a house party with your friends to talk about what's happening, that we have volunteer groups individually who regularly meet with their legislators, who hold small public events so that they can do public education around this. And then as simple as sharing out information on any given week about what's happening in the legislature on your personal social media or your own communication channels as well goes a long way.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for questions. Merissa, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing that important information. And I'll now turn it back over to Kyle.
Okay. Thank you, Audrey. And thank you again, Merissa, for joining us today and for the great work you're doing at ACLU to protect the right to vote and keep people informed on these bills and the impact that they would have on folks' access to the ballot. It's a priority for us, and we want to continue to partner with you to ensure that these do move forward. So as a reminder to everybody in our community who may be experiencing a need, including assistance, the impact of the recent flooding across the region, our 211 helpline remains available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We maintain a running list of available services in the community and can connect you to supports you might need. You can also look up the resources in your area by using our 211 database at unitedwaysem.org/211. And one other reminder is the emergency broadband benefit. Qualifying households can receive a discount of up to $50 per month toward internet service, and a one-time discount of $100 to purchase a digital service through this federal emergency broadband benefit. So we want to make sure everyone's aware of that and make use of it. Applying is fast and easy. For more information and to apply, you can call 313-241-7618. Our next town hall next Wednesday. What's the Word Wednesday? Will feature Dessa Coma, Executive Director of Detroit Disability Power, will discuss the anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act and talk about how to recognize and combat ableism. To view our previous town halls and more upcoming topics, please visit unitedwaysem.org/virtual town halls. The website is also in the chat box. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you soon. Continue to stay safe and live united.